Welcome to The Explainer. So, have you ever wondered what happens when a vocal activist suddenly gets handed the whistle and becomes the referee of the exact same market they used to protest? Well, today we're unpacking a really fascinating new report from the Property Economist about a recent appointment in Ghana. And honestly, it reveals practically everything about how a state thinks about a market. Whether you're an investor, an economics student, or just someone curious about how government policy directly shapes our built environment, this deep dive is going to clarify exactly how complex the housing market truly is. We're going to look strictly at the data and analysis provided in this report to understand the massive, real-world ripple effects of a single regulatory decision. The author of the report kicks things off with this really powerful observation about a policy signal from May 2026. The main takeaway here: personnel decisions at the highest levels of regulatory bodies aren't just, basic administrative shuffling. They are loud, blaring sirens to private capital about the rules of the game, and the market is definitely listening. Now, while the specifics we're looking at deal with Ghana, the underlying principles of market signals and regulatory risk apply globally to absolutely anyone trying to understand economics. Okay, let's dive right into this crazy dichotomy outlined by the report. The government just appointed Frederick Opoku to the seat of acting rent commissioner. His former gig? President of the National Tenants Union of Ghana. He was literally the country's most vocal anti-landlord advocate, spending years publicly attacking landlords and pressuring the government for stricter enforcement against them. But his new role demands that he act as a quasi-judicial referee. He's now expected to impartially mediate disputes and certify fair rents for the very people he built his entire career opposing. The report argues this isn't just some minor technicality, it's a massive structural conflict of interest. So here's how the report breaks down the ripple effects of this single personnel decision and why it might freeze millions in private capital. We're going to cover the regulator's appointment, the need for neutrality, the true cost of housing, 3 signals to investors, and finally, the path forward. Starting off with Section 1, the regulator's appointment, advocacy versus enforcement. Let's look at the trigger event, Opoku's immediate actions right after taking office. According to the analysis, literally within weeks of his appointment, the new commissioner went on the EIB network and publicly condemned specific student hostel rent increases. He explicitly used words like outrageous and exploitative. But, and this is the critical sequence of events highlighted by the report, he made these statements before completing any nationwide inspections, before any formal adjudication had even taken place, and totally without analyzing the underlying financial data of what the operators actually spent to build and finance those facilities. The author points out that he was essentially announcing sanctions before findings were even published. Moving to Section 2, the need for neutrality, and what the Rent Control Department actually is. Let's look at the legal framework he's operating in now, and why the report argues that early public condemnation is so problematic. The report argues that under the 1963 Rent Act, the Rent Control Department is absolutely not a tenant welfare bureau. Actually, Parliament designed it to be a totally neutral referee. Both landlords and tenants have to appear before it. For the whole department to function correctly, both parties must believe the referee is completely impartial. Otherwise, the entire system just breaks down. The analysis makes the point that when the person in charge has a long public history of advocating for one side over the other, that fundamental trust in neutrality is instantly compromised. And the report points out this isn't just some academic theory, right? It's grounded in constitutional law. They point to a landmark 1980 Supreme Court case, Tafur v. Attorney General. This precedent clearly establishes that administrative bodies must act fairly and reasonably. A decision-maker has to approach each case without prejudgment. By announcing that rents are exploitative and threatening closures before evidence is properly heard, the report notes that the regulator leaves himself and the entire department constitutionally exposed. It basically signals to landlords that the process is decided before they even walk through the door. All right, Section 3, the true cost of housing, the hidden math behind the rents. So what is the actual math behind these so-called exploitative rents? The report digs deep into the numbers that were allegedly ignored. Just listen to this range for a second, 28 to 42%. To put that into perspective, those are interest rates that would honestly make a credit card company blush. The report notes that student housing in Ghana is not a publicly funded utility. The government houses fewer than 1 in 10 students. The rest of that massive gap? It's filled by individual landlords who have to rely entirely on private capital. To build these student hostels, developers are taking out commercial bank loans with these staggering interest rates between 28 and 42%. That is a massive, massive financial burden before a single brick is even laid. Because the economic reality on the ground is just stark. Think about this. A standard 50-room hostel requires 8 to 12 million Ghanaian cedis in upfront investment. And on top of those brutal interest rates we just talked about, developers are facing construction inflation that has completely blown past 40% since 2022. Why? Well, largely because of currency depreciation, where the CD lost over 50% of its value against the US dollar, making imported building materials just astronomically expensive. The report makes a really profound argument here. When a rent increase exactly matches these soaring input costs, it isn't profit extraction. It's mere survival. Which brings us to Section 4, 3 signals to investors and the market response. Let's see how the market naturally reacts to this kind of environment. The report outlines a 3-step ripple effect that is currently sending a devastating signal to lenders. Step 1 is regulatory risk. When a former advocate controls your licensing, lenders just assume the regulator is going to side with tenants no matter what the contract says. Step 2, capital is not protected. If a regulator threatens to retroactively roll back rents on a building that's already finished, the whole return model collapses. No lender is going to underwrite a project if the revenue can just be erased by a sudden press conference. And Step 3, political enforcement. The market sees that sanctions are being driven by a political narrative of exploitation rather than a clear legal standard. Investors don't just complain about this risk, they price it in, or they just walk away entirely. And you know what they say, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. The analysis points out that Ghana has actually tried this exact approach before. Back in 1963, rigid rent control was established. Fast forward to 1990, and a major World Bank study in Kumasi proved the results. Forcing nominal rents artificially low completely wiped out the economic incentive for landlords. They stopped maintaining buildings, they withdrew their stock, and the housing market just shrank and deteriorated, leaving the very tenants the policy was supposed to protect with fewer and far worse options. The report warns that in 2026, by threatening rollbacks and ignoring market costs, the new commissioner is essentially proposing a rerun of an experiment that has already failed. Finally, Section 5, the path forward, the blueprint for supply. Let's look at how the report builds towards some tangible, evidence-based policy solutions, because it's not just about pointing out the flaws, they actually offer a blueprint. Instead of regulatory threats, the author recommends some really clear, immediate policies. First up, publish a quarterly rent index for university areas. This creates a data-driven reference point so that the term exploitative actually means something legally. Second, strictly enforce the existing law that caps advance rent at 6 months. Landlords asking for 1 or 2 years up front are already breaking the 1963 law. The author argues enforcing that would help tenants immediately without destroying the market. Third, de-risk the supply side by leasing out university land on 25-year concession terms to lower upfront land costs. And finally, waive import duties on construction materials specifically for student housing. These are practical levers that actually encourage building rather than just punishing the builders. Beyond the immediate fixes, the report calls for deep structural legal reforms, arguing that the 1963 Act is severely outdated. Parliament needs to enact a new Residential Tenancies Act modeled on modern frameworks. This new act needs to establish independent housing tribunals that are completely insulated from political appointments. And most crucially for this specific situation, the author notes it should formally firewall the regulator by explicitly requiring demonstrated impartiality for the rent commissioner role, legally prohibiting anyone who has recently served as an advocate from holding the position. So, the absolutely crucial point we take away from all of this: a country cannot regulate its way to affordable housing. It literally has to build its way there. You just cannot solve a supply shortage by penalizing the only people bringing private capital to build the supply. It leaves us with a very real, looming question posed by the report. When developers pause their projects due to regulatory fear, will the 350,000 university students in Ghana actually be able to find a room next September? It is a striking lesson in the intersection of policy, economics, and real estate. Thanks for joining this explainer of the source material.